The jungle above Cu Chi looked like any other patch of Vietnamese bush on that humid January morning in 1966. Dense green canopy, twisted roots, the stink of rotting leaves and wet earth. But beneath the boots of the American paratroopers, an entire hidden city was crawling in silence, a black labyrinth of tunnels stretching for more than 200 kilometers, swallowing men whole and giving back nothing but silence. The Yanks threw everything they had at those holes in the ground. Gas canisters, blocks of C4, flamethrowers, whole drums of diesel poured into the dirt like water into a bottomless grave. And still the Viet Cong kept shooting from nowhere, kept vanishing into nowhere, kept laughing at the most powerful army on the planet. But the real shock was still to come, because while the Americans stood there scratching their helmets, a handful of shirtless Australian sappers were already stripping down to their shorts, grabbing a torch and a knife, and crawling headfirst into a darkness nobody else dared to touch. This is the story Hollywood forgot to tell you. The story of how a bunch of sunburnt farm boys from Queensland and New South Wales, armed with a pistol and a bit of bush cunning, walked straight past the Pentagon playbook and invented an entire form of warfare from scratch. The Americans called it impossible. British observers called it suicidal. The diggers called it Tuesday. By the end of that operation, the generals in Saigon were quietly rewriting their manuals, pretending the whole thing had been their idea all along. The men who first vanished into the bowels of Cu Chi wore a slouch hat, their accent was pure outback, and the next surprise was already crawling toward the surface. Operation Crimp was supposed to be a triumph of American firepower. 8,000 troops from the United States 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red One, together with the Australian 1st Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, known simply as 1RAR, were dropped into the so-called Iron Triangle on the 8th of January, 1966. On paper, the mission looked straightforward. Find the enemy headquarters, destroy it, wipe out the rice caches, bring back prisoners for intelligence. But really, the paper version of the war and the ground version of the war had almost nothing to do with each other. Brigadier General Ellis Williamson, commanding the 173rd Airborne, to which the Aussies had previously been attached, had already been muttering that the Viet Cong were ghosts. His men could feel them, hear them, even smell the cooking fires. Yet they never saw a single enemy soldier standing upright long enough to shoot at. Something was wrong with the ground they were walking on, and that truth announced itself in the most brutal way possible. The first clue came when an American rifleman from the Big Red One literally fell through the jungle floor. One moment, he was pushing through bamboo. The next, he had dropped waist-deep into a camouflaged hatch no bigger than a dinner plate. He climbed out cursing, covered in red clay, and pointed his mates toward a black hole that smelled of smoke and damp rice. The officers gathered around, poked a stick inside, and ordered the standard American response that had already failed a dozen times that week. A smoke grenade down the shaft, a satchel of plastic explosive at the entrance, a loud bang, then a note in the logbook. Objective neutralized. Next hole, please. But the Australians watched all this with the kind of quiet contempt they usually reserved for a Pommy officer talking about cricket scores during a bushfire. Captain Alexander Sandy McGregor, commanding the 3rd Field Troop of the 1st Field Squadron, Royal Australian Engineers, had been studying the enemy for weeks. He was a young engineer from Sydney, quietly spoken, clean-shaven, and as stubborn as a mallee root. And what he had already worked out was something the generals still refused to accept. Those so-called spider holes were not fighting positions at all. They were doorways into something the Americans could barely imagine. McGregor told his men that blowing the entrances was not just useless, it was actively helping the enemy by sealing off the evidence. Every crater the Yanks left behind was another chapter of a book nobody would ever read. That evening, he made a decision that would change military history forever, and he made it without asking permission from anyone wearing American stars. The order was almost comically simple. Strip off your webbing, leave the rifle behind, take a torch and a pistol, and follow me down. The men looked at each other for about 2 seconds. Then Corporal Bob the Rat Boutelle, a wiry bloke from Queensland with a grin like a cracked tile, volunteered first. Sapper Les Colmar and Sapper Jim Marshall raised their hands next. None of them had any special training for what they were about to do, because no such training existed anywhere in the Western world. That is what makes this moment so extraordinary. They were about to become the world's first subterranean infantry, simply by sliding feet first into a hole and hoping the torch batteries held out. But the darkness, waiting for them down there, was thicker than any of them had imagined. The tunnels of Cu-Chi were not just holes. They were a fully functioning underground nation that had been growing since the 1940s, first as a refuge against the French, then expanded obsessively after the Americans arrived. In places, the complex went 3 levels deep, dropping as far as 10 meters below the surface. It contained sleeping quarters, kitchens with clever chimneys that dispersed smoke hundreds of meters away, field hospitals complete with operating tables, weapons workshops, printing presses, wells, and even small theaters where morale films were shown to exhausted fighters. The main passages were barely 60 centimeters wide and 80 centimeters high, deliberately built to the dimensions of a small Vietnamese laborer rather than a well-fed Western soldier. A bloke from Townsville carrying 20 kilos of gear would get stuck like a cork in a bottle. And that was before anyone even considered what waited in the side galleries. The defenses inside were a nightmare designed by men who had spent 2 decades thinking about almost nothing else. Trapdoors made of packed earth looked identical to the floor until you stepped on them and fell 2 meters onto sharpened bamboo stakes smeared with buffalo dung to guarantee infection. U-bend water traps forced anyone crawling through to submerge completely, holding his breath while pushing a torch ahead, never knowing whether a man with a pistol was waiting on the other side. Venomous bamboo vipers and crates were tied by string to bamboo poles near the ceiling, their fangs angled downward at exactly head height. Scorpions in jars were rigged to tip over. Trip wires were connected to grenades stolen from dead Americans. And of course, there was the living enemy. Patient fighters who could sit motionless for 6 hours in a side chamber, breathing through a bamboo straw, waiting for the crunch of a foreign boot. The first Australian to go down that shaft knew none of this in detail. He only knew that something unholy was breathing back at him from below. The worst was still crawling toward him in the dark. Captain McGregor led from the front, which is the way the Australian Army had always done business since Gallipoli. He squeezed into the first shaft with a pencil torch gripped between his teeth, a 9mm Browning high-power pistol in one hand and a captured Viet Cong bayonet in the other. Behind him came Boutelle, then Colmar, then Marshall, each man touching the ankle of the one in front so they would not lose contact in the blackness. The passage narrowed almost at once, forcing them onto their bellies, elbows scraping raw on sharp laterite clay. The air turned thick and stinking within seconds, a soup of old sweat, rotting fish sauce, gun oil, and the unmistakable sweet rot of recent human remains. Their torches picked up cigarette ends still warm enough to glow, a half-eaten bowl of rice, a child's sandal, a medical kit with French labels. The Viet Cong had been here minutes ago. But really, the most disturbing possibility was that they had not left at all. Every meter forward took the men farther from any hope of rescue. And what McGregor's team discovered in the first 48 hours alone rewrote the entire intelligence picture of the war. They crawled through more than 700 meters of passageway on that opening descent mapping every branch with a homemade compass and a ball of string tied to a root at the entrance. They found a fully equipped workshop turning out punji sticks and homemade claymores. They found a briefing room with a blackboard still covered in chalked troop movements in Vietnamese. They found a printing press cranking out propaganda leaflets addressed to American mothers. Then came the discovery that hit like a hammer. In a sealed chamber behind a false wall, they uncovered the single greatest intelligence haul of the entire Vietnam conflict up to that point. Tens of thousands of documents, maps of every United States base in the 3rd Corps Tactical Zone, lists of agents inside the South Vietnamese government, diaries of senior cadres, photographs of American officers taken from only meters away in Saigon nightclubs. The Americans had been drinking beer next to men who knew their names, their wives, and their children's schools. That is the moment the war stopped looking like a jungle firefight and started looking like an invisible machine that had already penetrated everything. The silence in the intelligence tent when those documents were carried out of the jungle was the sound of a superpower realizing it had been outwitted by men in black pajamas. And still, as shocking as that was, the tunnel war itself was only beginning. There was still one more twist nobody saw coming. Corporal Bob Boutelle did not come home from Cu Chi the way he went in. A few days into the operation, pushing deeper than anyone had yet dared, Boutelle crawled headfirst into a small chamber that turned out to be a carbon dioxide trap, a deliberately designed dead end where heavy gas pooled at floor level. The air itself betrayed him. Les Colmar, crawling right behind, managed to grab one boot and haul his mate backward through 30 meters of tunnel in total darkness, but it was already too late. Boutelle had quietly slipped away in a place so narrow his body had to be folded almost double to bring him to the surface. Back at base, the Australians buried him with the dry-eyed stubbornness their fathers had shown on the Kokoda track. No speeches, no medals pinned on a grieving widow in front of cameras. Just a quiet bier raised by men whose uniforms were still caked in the same red clay that had taken him. Sandy McGregor later said that losing Bob was the worst moment of his life. But the next morning he went straight back down the next hole, because the job was not finished, and neither was the shock headed for the American High Command. When the first crate of captured documents landed on the desk of the American J-2 intelligence chief in Saigon, the reaction was disbelief followed by something very close to panic. United States Military Assistance Command Vietnam, known as MACV, had assumed the Viet Cong in the Iron Triangle were a disorganized rabble of local farmers with rusty rifles. What the Australians dragged out of the ground proved the exact opposite. This was a professional military organization with staff, colleges, medical corps, engineering battalions, and an intelligence network that reached into the presidential palace itself. One American colonel reportedly threw his coffee cup against the wall when he read the transcripts. Another was heard muttering that the entire war plan for 1966 would need to be rewritten from the first page. And that is what makes this whole episode so devastating in hindsight. Every single scrap of that intelligence had been retrieved by 4 sweaty blokes from Australia who ignored a direct American procedure and went exploring with a torch. The diggers did not even bother to say, "I told you so." They were too busy planning the next descent. Their reputation was about to spread farther than anyone expected. Word moved quickly through Viet Cong ranks as well, and it moved with a chill. Captured fighters interrogated in the weeks after Operation Crimp described the Australians with a mixture of hatred and something uncomfortably close to awe. One prisoner, a platoon commander from the Cu Chi Regional Force, told his interrogator, through a South Vietnamese translator, that his men had been specifically ordered not to engage the foreign soldiers in the short trousers. The Americans, he said, were predictable. They would blow the entrance and leave. You could crawl to a deeper level and wait. The Australians were different. The Australians came in after you. The Australians brought the fight to a place where numbers meant nothing, and the only thing that mattered was who was willing to pull the trigger first at arm's length in the dark. Another captured document, a handwritten order from a district commander, instructed tunnel garrisons to collapse secondary passageways at the first sign that Australian engineers had entered the system. They were being treated as the primary threat in the entire sector. For a battalion of fewer than 800 men operating alongside 500,000 Americans, that was an extraordinary compliment paid in the only currency that counted, fear. And really, fear was now beginning to reshape the whole war. Back at McGregor's tent, the work of cataloguing the haul went on around the clock. The Australians had brought no specialist photographic gear because nobody had imagined such a thing would be needed in a jungle operation. So they improvised the way their fathers had improvised at Tobruk a generation earlier. They laid the captured documents out on ground sheets, photographed them page by page with a battered 35mm camera borrowed from an American war correspondent, and shipped the negatives straight back to Canberra via the Australian Embassy in Saigon. Within a fortnight, translators at the Joint Intelligence Organization were turning out a flood of reports that MACV was forced to acknowledge as the most valuable ground-level intelligence of the entire year. The Americans had started the operation expecting to teach the Australians how modern war was fought. They finished it quietly, sending liaison officers over to ask the diggers how on earth they had done it. The answer was painfully simple. They had not followed the rules because the rules were written by people who had never been down there. And out of that blunt truth, a new doctrine began to form, almost by accident, scribbled on the backs of ration cards and the insides of cigarette packets. McGregor and his sappers developed that doctrine in real time, and later it would be taught in military academies around the world. Always work in pairs. The lead man carries only the pistol and the torch. The second man carries the spare torch and the map string. Never fire unless you can see the target, because the muzzle flash in a confined space will blind you for half a minute, and the sound will leave you deaf long enough for a knife to find your ribs. Always check the ceiling as well as the floor, because the best ambush position is directly above your head. Never take off your boots, no matter how tight the passage, because the floor is paved with bamboo splinters dipped in human waste. Always carry a length of fishing line and a few small fish hooks, because tripwires can be disarmed by a bloke who grew up pulling bream out of the Hawkesbury. None of this was in any manual. All of it worked. And every one of those rules had already been paid for in blood. The Americans watching this unfold had two choices: admit the Australians had just invented a new form of warfare, or pretend it had never happened. To their credit, enough senior officers chose the first option. Within weeks of Operation Crimp closing down, the United States Army ordered the formation of specialist volunteer teams within each infantry division, men trained to go into the tunnels armed with pistols, torches, and knives, instead of rifles, grenades, and gas. They were given a nickname that would become famous in every newspaper from New York to London: the Tunnel Rats. Hollywood would later put them in films and television series, building whole myths around the brave Americans who crawled into the darkness beneath the jungle. But the men who actually invented the craft, the men who wrote the first textbook with their own elbows and their own courage, were barely mentioned in any of it. The Australians shrugged and kept working because they had not come for the credit anyway. They had come to finish a job the Yanks had started and abandoned. And the job, as it turned out, was only getting bigger. Sandy McGregor was awarded the Military Cross for his work at Cu Chi, one of the first of the Vietnam War given to an Australian. The citation was unusually blunt for a British Commonwealth honour. It described how he had personally led his men into the tunnel system on multiple occasions under conditions of extreme personal risk, and how the intelligence obtained had been of critical importance to Allied operations throughout 1966. MacGregor, being the man he was, later said the medal properly belonged to Boutelle and to every sapper who had crawled behind him with a torch between his teeth. He went home to Sydney, left the army, and spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen that the Australian soldier was the finest light infantryman in the world. Not because of his training, but because of his attitude. He refused to romanticize any of it. When interviewed decades later about the moment he first lowered himself into the darkness, he simply said that somebody had to do it, so it might as well be him. In 4 words, that was the entire Australian military tradition distilled into a single sentence. Those roots ran deeper than most foreign observers ever understood. They reached back to Gallipoli, to the trenches of the Western Front, to the dust of Tobruk, and to the terrible green hell of the Kokoda Track. Every Australian who went into the Coochie tunnels carried the ghost of a grandfather who had been ordered over the top at the neck by a British officer who had never bothered to check whether the supporting artillery was still firing. Every digger who ignored an American protocol in January 1966 was, in a quiet way, settling a very old debt. The distrust of foreign command. The insistence on doing things the Bush way. The refusal to waste a mate's life on a plan drawn up by somebody who had never seen the ground. All of it had been handed down from father to son for half a century. The tunnel rats of Coochie came from a long line of men who had learned the hard way that the officer in the clean uniform was often more dangerous than the enemy in front of you. And the tunnels only confirmed that lesson for another generation. By the time Operation Crimp officially wound down on the 14th of January 1966, the figures were staggering. Over 700,000 pages of documents had been recovered, 150 kilograms of medical supplies, more than 7 tons of rice, dozens of weapons, including Chinese-made mortars and anti-tank mines, and the first complete picture Western intelligence had ever obtained of how the Viet Cong actually organized themselves in the field. Australian casualties during the tunnel phase were remarkably light given the conditions, a tribute to MacGregor's methodical approach and to the sheer bloody-mindedness of the men who followed him. The Americans publicly declared the operation a success. The Australians quietly packed up their kit and moved on to the next job without fanfare. And the Viet Cong began immediately digging new tunnels, deeper and cleverer than before. The war, as every digger knew, was far from over. But something important had shifted in the jungle air. The enemy now knew that somewhere out there among the foreign soldiers were men who would follow them into hell itself with a torch and a grin. In the years that followed, the legend of the Australian sappers at Coochie spread through the Allied armies in whispers rather than headlines. American generals mentioned it reluctantly in after-action reports. British military attaches wrote, admiring cables back to London. Even Soviet advisors in Hanoi reportedly asked their Vietnamese hosts to explain exactly who these Australians were and why they behaved so differently from the other Westerners. The answer was always the same. They were farmers and mechanics and shearers and laborers who had been handed a rifle and a plane ticket and told to sort it out. They did not believe in parade ground discipline. They did not believe in polished boots. And they certainly did not believe in orders that made no sense. What they believed in was each other, in a job properly finished, and in going home in one piece if possible. Everything else was what they called bull dust. And really, in the Australian military vocabulary, bull dust was the enemy of every good soldier. The general who signed off on Operation Crimp received a commendation for his leadership and eventually retired to write his memoirs. Sandy MacGregor became a motivational speaker and a beloved figure at veterans reunions right across Australia, still telling the same stories with the same quiet grin well into his 80s. Corporal Bob Boutelle lies in a quiet cemetery a long way from the red clay of Coochie, his name cut into cold stone alongside the other diggers who never made it back from the green country. If you ask the old sappers who served under MacGregor who really won that battle beneath the jungle, they will not point to a medal or a map or a press release from MACV headquarters. They will raise a glass to Bob. They will mutter something rude about the brass, and they will tell you that the only men who truly know what happened down there are the ones who came back covered in mud with a torch in one hand and a bayonet in the other. The rest is just paperwork. And paperwork, as every digger will tell you, has never once won a war. That, in the end, is why the story matters. Not because it flatters Australia, not because it embarrasses America, but because it reveals something brutally simple about war itself. The side with the bigger headquarters, the louder briefings, and the thicker manuals does not always understand the battlefield better than the men crawling through it on their bellies. The jungle at Cu Chi swallowed arrogance whole. It punished routine. It mocked firepower used without understanding. But it rewarded the men who were willing to look at the ground, trust their instincts, and go where nobody else wanted to go. The Australians did not arrive with a grand theory. They did not have specialist equipment, laboratory-tested doctrine, or a stack of approved procedures from some distant headquarters. What they had was nerve, improvisation, and the kind of stubborn practicality that had already been burned into the Australian military tradition from Gallipoli to the Western Front, from Tobruk to Kokoda. They looked at a problem the Americans were trying to blast apart from above and understood almost immediately that the answer was below. That is what changed everything, because once the first Australian sappers went down those shafts, the war in the Iron Triangle could no longer be understood in two dimensions. The battlefield was not just jungle, village, and paddy field. It was vertical. It was layered. It was alive beneath the feet of the men sent to fight on it. The tunnel systems were not merely hiding places. They were command posts, hospitals, factories, storehouses, intelligence hubs, and escape routes, all fused into one underground organism. And the moment that truth was dragged into daylight, every Allied commander in Vietnam was forced to reckon with the fact that he had been fighting only half the battlefield. That is why the intelligence haul mattered so much. 700,000 pages was not just a big number. It was a complete rupture in the illusion that the Viet Cong in that sector were scattered guerrillas, improvising from day to day. Those documents revealed organization, planning, discipline, and reach. They showed how deeply the enemy had embedded itself not only under the soil of the Iron Triangle, but inside the political and military life of South Vietnam itself. Maps of United States bases, lists of agents, diaries of senior cadres, photographs of American officers taken only meters away in Saigon nightclubs. That is not the work of an amateur force. That is the work of a hidden state at war. And still, the strangest part is how quietly the Australians absorbed all of it. No grand speeches, no theatrical victory laps, no chest-thumping declarations that they had changed the war. They simply photographed the pages, packed the crates, learned the lessons, and prepared for the next descent. That restraint says as much about them as the courage it took to enter the tunnels in the first place. They were not interested in turning themselves into legends. They were interested in finishing the job and keeping their mates alive. Sandy MacGregor understood that better than anyone. His military cross recognized what everybody around him already knew, that he had led from the front, entered the tunnel systems himself on multiple occasions, and recovered intelligence of critical importance to Allied operations throughout 1966. But really, even that citation only captures part of the truth. His real achievement was not simply bravery, it was clarity. He saw before most others that blowing tunnel entrances was destroying evidence, sealing off understanding, and leaving the enemy's real strength untouched. He saw that the only way to beat that underground system was to enter it, map it, learn it, and fight inside it on its own terms. That was not just courage. That was military imagination under pressure. And that imagination came at a cost. Bob Boutelle paid part of that price with his life. Suffocated in a carbon dioxide trap in a place so narrow his body had to be folded almost double to bring him back to the surface. Les Colmar paid for it with the memory of dragging his mate backward through 30 meters of darkness, knowing the tunnel itself had already taken him. Every rule MacGregor's men later wrote down. Every lesson about pairs, pistols, torches, boots, ceilings, tripwires, muzzle flash, and map string had blood behind it. That is the part later myths often smooth over. The doctrine was not born in a classroom. It was born in fear, trial, improvisation, and loss. The Americans eventually recognized the value of what had been created. Specialist volunteer teams were formed inside United States Army divisions. Men were trained to carry pistols, knives, and torches instead of rifles, grenades, and gas. The name Tunnel Rats entered the public imagination. It became famous. It became cinematic. But the first men who had truly written that tradecraft in the clay of Cu-Chi were Australians, and they did it before the world had a name for what they were. That is why this story deserves to be remembered properly, not as a footnote, not as a colorful side episode in a much larger American war, but as one of the clearest examples in modern military history of small unit initiative overturning institutional certainty. A few men in slouch hats looked at a battlefield everyone else thought they understood and realized the battlefield was lying to them. Then they crawled into that lie with a torch between their teeth and came back with the truth. And maybe that is the final image that matters most. Not the maps, not the medals, not the reports in Saigon. It is the sight of those men disappearing one by one into the earth, armed with almost nothing, knowing full well that the dark ahead could hold bamboo stakes, snakes, grenades, gas, or a waiting pistol at arm's length. They went anyway. They went because somebody had to do it. They went because the men above ground were getting nowhere. They went because the job was there, and because Australians of that generation had been raised to believe that when the official plan stopped making sense, you did not whine about it. You fixed it. So when people talk about the tunnel war in Vietnam, they should remember where the craft truly began. It began at Cu-Chi in January 1966. It began with Sandy MacGregor, Bob Boutelle, Les Colmar, Jim Marshall, and the other sappers who stripped off their gear, picked up a torch and a pistol, and crawled into a hidden world no Western army had ever seriously tried to master before. The Americans would later name it. Hollywood would later dramatize it. But the Australians were the ones who first proved it could be done. And in that black labyrinth under the red clay, they did more than clear tunnels. They exposed an enemy system, forced a superpower to rewrite its assumptions, and invented a new form of war, one crawl space at a time. That is not myth. That is not nostalgia. That is what happened beneath the jungle at Cu-Chi when the men in slouch hats went down and the rest of the war finally had to catch up. Thank you for listening. If you found this story useful, leave a comment, like, and subscribe to support us, and share your thoughts with us.